we're going to be looking at some of our interpersonal perceptions, basically how we figure out what other people are thinking, what their motivations are, why they do certain things, and we're going to transition into things like how do we behave in groups, and how do we decide what is normal or abnormal behavior within groups or social settings. So a bunch of really cool topics today. And as per usual, we're going to probably hit a bunch of these topics fairly quickly because there's lots and lots of interrelated terms and interrelated ideas. So when they're presented together, sort of as a grouping, that's one of those signs that maybe you're going to have to tell me which of these a situation is describing in one of those multiple choice questions I love to ask. So our standard start definitions, which is social cognition. And it's going to be exactly what it sounds like. We know that when we've talked cognition before, it's all about how we think about things, how we conceptualize things. And the social aspect is just adding the fact that we interact with other people in social settings. I consistently talk about the fact that humans are social creatures. So this is a really important thing to understand when we're looking at human behavior, especially when we're reacting and interacting with others. So this is all about how we think about and try to make sense of the actions of those around us. And this is really important because if we think about it, what we've talked about before, if we go all the way back to our behaviorist versus cognitive behaviorist versus cognitive psychologist debate, where we were saying they differed in terms of what they wanted to look at for behavior. So a behaviorist would be all about external visible actions, and the more cognitive side delves into those internal conscious actions. And that internal process is actually something that's fairly hidden. That's why our social or our cognitive behaviorists have to use behaviorist techniques to try and figure out what's going on internally. Those internal processes are hidden and unobservable. So when we're looking at other people's behavior, whether it's as a researcher or just somebody who's been bumped into in a crowd, we have to start making some assumptions or inferences about what that person's motivation was based on context, because we can't just see what's going on in their head. And even if you asked them what they were doing and why they did it, you might not be guaranteed an accurate response. They might have intentionally bumped you. Maybe they did that thing in the hallways. If you had a crowded school, my high school was jam-packed, and you had your elbows up to be able to get between classes. But if anybody called you out on being aggressive, you would say something like, oh, it was totally an accident. I definitely didn't mean to sort of push you out of the way so I could get across campus. But that's one of those, people can sort of mislead you. They cannot tell you the truth. All those things that we've had when we look at our self-reports, that's part of this too. So all of that saying, we have to make some assumptions. So this concept of an inference, assuming the motivations behind a behavior or what's going on internally, that's a really important part of this whole section of this chapter. So the first of these, we can talk about category-based inferences. So these are going to be assumptions that are based on information about categories or groups that an individual belongs to. So this is actually when we're going to get to talk about stereotyping. Basically, we have a label that describes a category of individuals or things or whatever. We're actually going to be able to tie it nicely back to our discussion on intelligence when we were looking at things like problem solving and group membership. That also applies here, but now we're applying it to humans. We're then going to talk about target-based inferences. And this is when we start making assumptions based on the information about an individual's behavior. So rather than the group being the important part, the individual is the important part. And we're actually going to focus on these category-based inferences first, and there's a whole bunch of them. So first off, we have a couple of useful terms, things that we might have talked about before, may or may not have had definitions before. Again, there's lots of overlap with some of the earlier chapters, which makes it nice and easy for you guys because some of this is familiar, but we're also applying it in a somewhat new setting, so we're extending that knowledge. But first off, we have mental sets, and this is all talking about different kinds of mental shortcuts. A big chunk of this sort of category-based inference discussion is going to be based on the fact that we don't always have all the information. And so sometimes we have to make assumptions based on limited or incomplete information. So a mental set might be part of how we make some of those assumptions. So this is just our tendency to perceive the world in a particular way. So we have sort of base assumptions, we have base ways of thinking, and those can actually shape how we might interpret information. If we are ready to receive a certain type of information, anything ambiguous might be more interpreted in that way. So this is where we have that tie back to problem solving, even things like functional fixedness. That's because of having a mental set where we are stuck only thinking about something in one way. We can also use the term schemas. This is another one of those broad terms talking about some of our mental shortcuts. So these are some mental frameworks or mental sets that help us organize and interpret information. In some places, they'll make distinctions between these two terms and go into more detail about their differences and similarities. I just like putting both down because in our sort of broad interpretation, they're both going to be talking about those mental shortcuts. So whenever you see those terms, you kind of know what's going on here. But whatever the case is, having these mental shortcuts can actually lead us to have certain expectations depending on how we've conceptualized some object or some category or something. So this is where we're going to lead into stereotypes as our way of thinking about a particular group. Now, there's going to be a lot of terms in this chapter where there are sort of societies, frameworks, and understandings of the terms. And then there's the more sort of academic interpretations. And we're going to focus on that academic interpretation here. Because usually you see the idea of a stereotype and the mental connotation is immediately bad or negative. But if we go by the strict definition, a stereotype is just an attitude or opinion about people based on their group affiliation, basically which group they belong to, or their category membership. So if we think of stereotypes of Canadians, what do people assume about Canadians or Americans? We might have certain sort of ideas of how that group should behave. So Canadians are thought to be nice. They're going to be kind, things like that. But you've probably met unkind Canadians because we're part of that group, and therefore we're going to have maybe some differing opinions on those stereotypes. But it's a lot easier to think about stereotypes of groups that are outside of your experience. Now, we'll get into that more in a minute, but I do want to stress here that this is just making some general assumptions. We're having some sort of mental shortcuts based on limited information. Again, that's what this whole section is about, these mental shortcuts, whether we call them schemas or whatever else. We're basically making assumptions because we don't have all the information. So this isn't necessarily bad. This can be something that's fairly useful with that limited amount of information. Basically, if we don't have anything to base our behavior off of or base our assumptions and expectations off of, we're better off with a vague framework than with nothing at all. So we're keeping in mind that this isn't always accurate based on wherever that information has come from, whether it's from actually interacting with other people. So maybe you've met a couple and you have sort of this base understanding of who they are and how they are, and maybe they're representative of that group. So I don't know tons of Americans, but one of my office mates was from America. So I've sort of interpreted her behavior as sort of my experience with Americans. But understanding that that's not necessarily matching the stereotypes that exist. You can also get it from things like social media, watching things on TV or movies. You base those sort of experiences sort of helping you build up that framework of how you think about that particular group. So we're deciding category membership based on our exposure. So my example, and I've been throwing in a couple of examples. I'm trying something different with my slides, but the example that I use to show that stereotypes are not always bad is actually from experience. So if you think about it, I teach classes all the way from 100 level intro psych classes all the way up to 400 level seminars. I've even dabbled teaching some grad level classes. And depending on those classes, I might be facing, say, 400 students at a time. So interacting with any one student, I don't really have a whole lot to go off of. So I'm teaching an intro class and I want to explain a concept. Somebody's come up and asked me a question. I'm going to make an assumption. They're in an intro class. So I'm going to make my explanation match what a standard intro level student would be able to understand. So sometimes you're simplifying, sometimes you're explaining terms. But in that interaction, I'm sort of doing the best I can with that limited information. Maybe they let me know that they're a fourth year bio student and they're just here for an elective. Well, now all of a sudden I realize that they have very different knowledge pools and maybe I can stop simplifying things. So until I had that extra experience, I made some assumptions and I did the best I could, but I have to be able to adapt and customize interactions based on what I've learned about those individuals. So you can think of it as sort of your baseline, I don't know any better, and I know that this is a limited mental set or something that's one of my mental shortcuts. And as I gain new information, I can update those assumptions. So that's my example of looking at classes. And again, if I started at, say, a 300 level class or a 400 level class, my explanations would be very, very different. It's one of those reasons why I stress that when students contact me with questions, they tell me which class they're from, because the class you're in will dramatically influence the level of detail in an answer, even if you're asking the exact same question. All right, so I did start hinting at the fact that we have experience encountering people who belong to our own groups. So if you identify as Canadian, well, you probably know a bunch of other Canadians. And you realize that, yeah, there are some that are really nice, there are some that are really grumpy and mean. So you realize that there's going to be some differences there. So our perception of these differences within a group and even with between groups is actually going to change depending on the affiliation of the perceiver. So you are going to perceive Canadians as different than someone from a completely different country because you belong to that group. You are affiliated with that group. So we have an assumption that our group or the in group, the one that we are part of or within, is actually heterogeneous. Basically, we know that there's lots of diversity there because we have experience with that diversity. We know that not all Canadians are the same, and therefore we know that we should treat those people differently, maybe based on experience. But with limited experience with other groups or out groups, the ones that are outside of our affiliations, we view them as homogeneous, basically saying that they are sort of uniform and consistent. Again, limited information, so we're going to be making assumptions based on whatever we have available to us. So those assumptions lead us to treating large groups of people fairly similarly until we gain that experience. So we have more experience with our own group, we have more experience with those differences and adapt accordingly, but we have much less experience with those outgroups, so much less information to base our assumptions on, and again, we react accordingly. All right, and I think this might be an extension to that, which is basically saying that we're going to underestimate within category variability, and we assume that if things have the same label, that we're going to sort of think of them the same way. So actually, this is a little bit different. I was going to say this is still under stereotypes, but it could technically just be under category identities. But if stereotypes are about categories or groups, then that's fine. It all overlaps. But basically saying that by the nature of putting things into categories, we like to fit things into boxes. So we have names for groups of things. Back in the intelligence chapter, I believe, and or language, we talked about things like birds as a group. There's going to have some, say, overarching features, some that are characteristic of that group, and then you have some variation, but we have some general assumptions that all birds in general are like this. So those labels put us in mind of the thing that's sort of the prototype of that group. This is the thing that represents that group and the characteristics associated. So those labels can actually shape how we think about things. And that way of thinking about them can actually end up can actually end up sort of reducing our perceived variability in real world observations. So we end up actually assuming that if things are labeled the same, we're going to assume that they are more similar than things that are labeled differently. And that's sort of a weird way to talk about it, but there's an example from the textbook. And in this case, we were actually looking at, let me double check my lines here. So in this case, we're looking at the length of different lines. And if we were sort of showing people them sort of separated out, they're all on their own, they're not grouped at all, 1 through 6, we kind of get the feel that there are set differences between them. And then the weird part here is if we group them, if we put 3 of them together and call them group A, and we put 3 of them together and call them group B, these are technically the same length when people were looking at them. These here are the estimates of the length of those lines, where people will actually end up thinking that group A is more similar to each other and group B ends up being more similar to each other, and actually finding larger differences between A and B. So that's why we say that if they're labeled the same, we overestimate how similar they are. And if they are labeled differently, we tend to overestimate how different they are. So our perception ends up sort of shifting a little bit. This also works really well for an easy to visualize example. That would be color. So if we have a bunch of things that are labeled as blue, we're going to perceive them as similar in shade. So if something has a name or a label that says blue, you're going to likely group them together. And if something is labeled, say, green, you might group those together. This is one of my pet peeves. Again, I've done art for quite a while, and colored pencils have an interesting naming scheme. And sometimes things are labeled as blue but are very, very green, but people will usually cluster them over with the blues just by the name. So that name makes us think that it belongs to that category, and we perceive it as more blue. It's not until you start organizing things based on shades that you go, wait a second, this is technically green, but I had it over there with the blues. So there's all sorts of ways that we do this, but it's kind of showing the power of those labels sort of belonging to a category and how it can shape how we think about those things. All right, what else can we talk about? With these stereotypes, we actually have the tendency to perpetuate stereotypes. This is one of those things where when I describe stereotypes as a general concept, and I mentioned the fact that you start with your limited information and then you have to adjust to match new information as it comes in, people are sometimes resistant to making those changes. It's actually something we've mentioned before. Yet again, repetition. But we've talked before about the fact that people don't like to change their minds. They don't like to be shown that they're wrong. They don't like to have to correct their assumptions or understandings. They'd rather that they were right all along. So we tend to cling to things that match the way that we were thinking about stuff before. So that's where this self-perpetuating stereotype idea comes in, where once we have a way of thinking, our behavior tends to lead us to try and perpetuate that way of thinking, whether it's intentional or not. So sometimes this can be a completely unconscious process. We don't even realize we're doing it. Sometimes people are more conscious about it and they're maybe distorting reality to match their perceptions. But all of this is sort of influencing the fact that we like to be consistent and we like to be right. And that's going to be a common thread throughout the rest of this chapter because we tend to delude ourselves a little bit. We have biases to try and make ourselves feel better. So the first of these is something called the self-fulfilling prophecy or behavioral confirmation. Now, this is basically saying that if we have a certain conception of what we're expecting, we tend to behave in a way where we basically assume that that's exactly what's going to happen. And when we behave that way, we end up influencing that environment. Maybe we act cold towards somebody because we were told that they're mean. And because of that, now that we've been cold towards them, well, they're going to be cold back. And we go, well, yeah, obviously they are mean. I expected they would be mean. They were mean to me. And therefore, I was right in assuming that meanness. So by acting coldly towards them, I was preparing myself for that. So your expectations affect your behavior towards others, and that ends up causing those expected behaviors that will then confirm your expectations. So I have this diagram that I borrowed from one of my other classes that basically says we are told, or yeah, we are told that somebody is unfriendly. So start off our expectation, your friend George, he's unfriendly. And you then go in and say, okay, I've been told that he's unfriendly. I'm going to be guarded and cautious because I don't want this unfriendly person to make me feel bad. So I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to be a little bit withdrawn. And then because you've now been unfriendly yourself, you're more guarded and withdrawn. Well, George is responding to that behavior in a fairly unfriendly fashion. They're matching your energy. They're going to behave the same way you have. But by doing so, you've now confirmed that, yes, I expected that he would be unfriendly. He was unfriendly. Therefore, I was right. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you hadn't gone into that situation with that expectation and modified your behavior accordingly, well, you might not have had that same response. You might not have had that unfriendly attitude in return. This concept of sort of having these ideas of stereotypes and sort of that self-fulfilling prophecy ties nicely to a concept called stereotype threat. There are a couple of sort of special cases of each of our different topics today. And this is a really neat one where this is when an individual or a group ends up experiencing significant fear of confirming negative expectations about the group they belong to. And because now they're really worked up, they're really afraid of having that happen, it actually ends up affecting their actions and can lead to them fulfilling that expectation, that stereotype. So, a fantastic example of this is this study by Osborne back in 2007, where they basically leaned into the stereotype or the idea that girls are not as good at math as boys. So they have lots of people who are maybe reminded of this fact before they take a test. So you'd have two groups, one where they're going to, here it's high ST, high stereotype threat. Basically, as you walk into a standardized test, you have somebody talking very loudly about the fact that boys are better at math, boys have better mathematical thinking, creating stress where girls are worried about the fact that if they do poorly, that's going to end up confirming that sort of negative stereotype. The other group, the low ST, is low stereotype threat. And basically the same group, or a different group taking the same test is going to go in without somebody reminding them of that bias, of that sort of difference in performance. And what we get to see here, there's no error bars as per usual with intro stuff, but I will tell you that these two here are not significantly different. So they end up performing the same if there isn't that reminder of differences in performance. But if you've had a reminder of those differences in performance, all of a sudden the average test scores fall for the group that was being told that, you're going to perform worse. So you have that stress, that anxiety about not wanting to perform worse. And by being in that heightened state, you're unable to focus and it makes you perform worse. There's all sorts of different studies that have shown this across the years, targeting different groups. So when there's stereotypes about things like being good or bad at certain things, if they are reminded of those facts, it tends to end up producing consistent measures. So that's why we've listed this as a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you're not so much going in with your own assumptions, but somebody is making you aware of some assumption, and then you end up making that happen. So it adversely affects your performance based on those expectations. All right. What else do we have in terms of these self-perpetuating stereotypes? We have perceptual confirmation. And again, we've mentioned this before, probably back in chapter 2, though not with this name, but this is when observers perceive what they expect to perceive. So we tend to overweight information that matches our expectations, and we tend to underweight information that contradicts our expectations. And we've mentioned this exact pattern a couple of different times. The first would be things like our single versus double blind experiments. where if a researcher has an expectation, if they know that somebody is in the experimental group or the control group, they're more likely to interpret ambiguous information as supporting whatever matches their original theory. So if they know those groups, they have a tendency to have more evidence that supports whatever you'd expect if their theory is correct. This can also come from that idea that people, if given the chance to say, look up information, if we gave you magazine articles and we told you that this particular thing is true, I think we mentioned this with catharsis. And if you tell people or convince people that it's true and then give them a chance to flip through a bunch of magazines with articles that support or refute it, they spend more time with the articles that match what they've been convinced of. So we like to find information that matches our existing beliefs, our existing expectations. So this can be something that's intentional, can be something that we're seeking out, but it can also be things like stuff that matches our beliefs tends to catch our eye, or it tends to be more memorable. I think I mentioned this before when we were looking at maybe our present bias. I can never remember if that's this class or the methods class I teach right after, where we match a lot of our chapter 2 stuff. But that's the case where we tend to notice when things happen in conjunction. And I usually use my example of driving to work. And those red lights are really memorable because they're super inconvenient and they take up more of your time. And you sit there and stare at this red light while you fume about being late for something. But we tend not to notice the green lights because they don't stop us, they don't register. So we're looking for information. And if you're wanting to complain about how many red lights you hit, you're only remembering the reds and not remembering the greens. All of that ties into the same logic here, where once we have those expectations or beliefs, we're going to be sort of overweighting information that matches it, and it can be intentional or unintentional. And the last of these sort of factors that are coming from these self-perpetuating stereotypes is something called subtyping. And this is a tendency for individuals who are faced with evidence that doesn't match their sort of expectations. They actually end up modifying their stereotypes, basically adding a subtype to that group or category that they're looking at, rather than completely abandoning those larger stereotypes. So I'll use my American example where I said my office mate was or is American, was as in we're moving offices, but she's still American. But I'd say, okay, well, she's an American, but she's an American living in Canada, or she's an academic American. So adding caveats there where you might still have a stereotype about the group as a whole, but you'd say, well, this individual that I have experience with, they're the exception, or they're different, or they fall under this subcategory or subtype within that stereotype. So we don't want to be wrong about the group as a whole. So we're going to do some mental gymnastics and relabel the specific individual so that all this new information we're encountering still fits within our original assumption. So all of these are tying back to that fact that once we have a particular framework for thinking about a group, we like to keep it that way. We like that consistency. Now, moving on, if I'm focusing so much on stereotypes and the fact that they aren't necessarily bad, but that's all focusing on how they might be inaccurate and how they might be problematic if we're not able to adjust and adapt our ways of thinking as we gain more information, we of course can then tie it into prejudice and discrimination, which is where we do get that negative connotation. So prejudice is going to be learned negative attitudes or opinions that a person has towards certain groups. Now, this is very, very similar to stereotypes, except we've added that negative component. We're also stressing that this is going to be a learned process. This is something that we have to acquire over time. So we suppose stereotypes are learned, as are most of our category labels as well. But this is something they tend to stress in a bunch of the textbooks that I've used, simply because they wanted to show that prejudice isn't something innate. You don't automatically dislike a particular group or think poorly of them. It's something that comes from either experience or having somebody else tell you certain things in that negative format. So we can think of stereotypes as those overgeneralizations that are not necessarily negative. They're just shortcuts, mental shortcuts for thinking about groups when we have not enough information to make an accurate representation. Prejudice is when we're getting to that process of negative frameworks, and we can actually see that those negative ways of thinking can end up influencing our actions, which leads us into discrimination. And prejudice is a massive field. There's lots of stuff you can look at in terms of what's going on behind prejudice. And the fact that some of these negative thoughts and the way that we think of different groups has changed dramatically over time. And a lot of this has come from both sort of social norms, which we'll see in a couple of slides. Basically, as we're exposed to certain things or certain ways of thinking, we tend to adjust our behavior over time, but it also comes to things like there's a free flow of information now. It's easier to experience somebody else's opinion, to get information that shows you that these different groups are not homogeneous, they are heterogeneous. There's lots of diversity there. So that's something that's changing as time goes on. But again, an entire field of research if you're interested. And as I said, that prejudice can lead to discrimination is when you use sort of those negative thoughts and put them into action. So adverse behaviors that are directed at particular groups that you hold negative and prejudicial beliefs towards. So prejudice is the negative attitude. Discrimination is a negative action or behavior that's based on that attitude. So that's how we're splitting these up. And again, if I'm taking some time to say, hey, here's the difference between a stereotype versus a prejudice versus discrimination, definitely something that might be worth knowing. All right, so that's our crash course on our category-based inferences. We're talking about groups and how we think about groups. We will come back to groups again a little bit later towards the end of the chapter, but this is about making assumptions about groups. Later on, we'll look at how we behave in groups. But that said, we now can talk about those target-based inferences where we start making assumptions based on the information we have about an individual's behavior. Basically, in a situation, somebody acts a particular way, and we need to make a decision about why they've acted that way. So targeted to an individual rather than a broader group or category. So what's our big term here? We're starting with attributions. So these are inferences or assumptions about the causes of our own and other people's behavior. Usually, when we start thinking about attributions, a lot of the theories focus on the other's behavior and how we interpret others' actions, but we do have some ways that those apply to ourselves because sometimes we do things and we need to sort of logic why we did that. Again, we don't always have sort of a planned out reason for why we've acted a specific way. Maybe we are reactive. Maybe you're in a bad mood and you've snapped at somebody. You didn't mean to do it, but you snapped, and now you have to sort of justify why were you mean to that person? Well, maybe you look at it and go, I had a terrible start to my day. I got stuck at every single red light on my way to work. And that irritability meant that I overreacted. So it's a response based on my environment. I'm not a mean person, I just had a really bad day. And we'll actually get to label those kinds of sort of explanations or justifications as we get through the next few slides. But all of this is saying we're trying to understand why something happened. Is it because of something internal? Is it because of something external? How are we going to credit this behavior? And some of these attributions, the assumptions that we make as to why somebody did something, those actually can affect our subsequent behavior and emotions because, well, now we've made some assumptions about how that person has acted or who they are as an individual. If it wasn't you snapping at somebody and you know that you were just snappy because you're having a bad day, you haven't had your coffee yet, you had a really rough time with traffic, whatever it is, you would say, okay, well, they know that I'm not a bad person. I'm just, having a bad day. But if somebody else snaps at you, you're probably pretty likely to say, well, they're just grumpy. They're mean. I don't like that person, especially if you've never encountered them before. So we've now said, okay, well, that person is mean. We're not assuming they had a bad day and hit red lights. We're saying that is who they are as an individual. And we saw with some of our self fulfilling prophecies, well, if I anticipate that somebody's mean, I'm going to react accordingly. They snapped at me, and now I'm going to snap back. Or I'm going to avoid them or be cold towards them. And now moving forward, we've shaped this relationship, these interactions. So in those cases, that example is we reacted with anger. We weren't trusting that they just had a bad day. We assume they're a bad person. So we weren't understanding. We were more angry. So what are the proper names for some of these attributions? We have two broad categories. I've already talked about the internal versus external, but those actually have other labels too. So we can talk about internal attributions are also called dispositional attributions. And if you think of what somebody's disposition is, we're talking about who they are as a person. So this would be more of a personal attribution. So we're going to attribute someone's actions to their internal disposition, to who they are as a person, to their personality, or whatever else we want to talk about. So if we were looking at somebody, you're meeting a new person, you're supposed to meet up and start working on a project, and they're late. They were supposed to be here at 10 a.m. and now it is 10:15. If you're making an internal or dispositional attribution, you'd say that that person, Jane, is an irresponsible person. She doesn't value my time and hasn't come because sort of they're not responsible enough. So I now have this useless, lazy partner for my project, and I'm going to react accordingly. I'm going to be really angry when they get here. In contrast, the external situations, our situational attributions, are going to be based on that environment. It's not about who the person is, it's about the moment, the situation they've encountered. So, same thing, my lab partner is late for this group project, and I'm going to be more considerate. I'm assuming there's traffic. Pretty much every street going through the city has some kind of traffic. Construction is redirected lots, so I'm going to be patient. Yeah, they're only 15 minutes late. It's likely that something happened. I'm going to wait and see when they get here. So if they show up and they apologize, you'd be more likely to be forgiving and understanding because you blame the situation that they were in. I really loved this diagram here. As per usual, I like collecting my weird figures. So this, I have no idea why they chose that. I do also like the diagram. I was going to cut it out, but I couldn't cut it out. But this is looking at how we decide, how we attribute those actions to a particular cause. And this actually comes from Keeley in 1967. Um, it might also be Kelly. I'm not quite sure where the emphasis is. But for this situation, we're going to ask ourselves sort of three questions. And we're going to look at the consistency of a behavior, the consensus of that behavior or individuals looking at that behavior, and the distinctiveness of that behavior. Now, while this one is kind of an okay layout, I actually like this diagram, again, from a different class, but I like it because it includes an example. So here we have the same thing, consistency, consensus, and distinctiveness as our three questions or our three attributional factors. And we're going to ask ourselves, based on this behavior, what is our consistency? So we have a student, Kim, which I always thought was interesting. My name doesn't come up in examples all that often, but Kim says that her art class is really boring. In terms of consistency, if we say high consistency, this individual always says that this art class is boring. Every day that this class happens, they leave the class and complain about how boring the class is. Or if we have low consistency, which isn't on this diagram, but if we had low consistency, they've had, they complain about it today and then never again. In those cases, you wouldn't really attribute it to something internal or external. If they're inconsistent, you kind of just know that it was a day. And then everything else, they're always fine with it. So that wouldn't be something you'd have to interpret more deeply, just in case you were wondering why both were high. And that always sticks out to me when I start explaining. Next, we can have our consensus, because that was the order that this one did it. Consensus is, how do other people talk about this thing? So Kim says that the class is boring, but other students say that it's great. Consensus is low. This is only this one student saying that it's boring, so we think that it's maybe something to do with them. If we have high consensus, though, if everybody says the class is boring, we're going to be looking a little bit more at the fact that it might be that external factor, that it might be the class itself. Then we want distinctiveness. This is another one of our important keys here. And we're asking, okay, is this particular claim, this particular behavior, is it consistent for this individual, or is this outside of their normal behavior? So if we have low distinctiveness, we're saying that, well, Kim says all of her classes are boring. In that case, complaining about this one class isn't really something about the class, it would be all classes. And the sort of constant between all of those classes is her. So that gives us that leaning that, well, it's probably more of a person problem than a class problem. And if we have high distinctiveness, we're saying that this is a really distinct and unique situation. This is the only class that she complains about, and therefore it's not necessarily that she finds everything boring. It's much more likely that this class itself is boring. So if we're summing all of this up, we're saying, okay, what are we going to decide? If we have high consistency, low distinctiveness, and low consensus, we're going to say that it's a personal attribution. We're going to blame this on Kim being overly critical. So we'd say, all right, they consistently say the class is boring. They say that all classes are boring and nobody else agrees. This is definitely a her problem. So we've made that personal attribution. But if we have high consensus, high consensus, so everybody says the class is boring, high distinctiveness, this is weird for her to say that the class is boring, and high consistency, it's always something she finds boring. Well, now it's something external. It's very unlikely to just be her. We're going to attribute this to the situation. It's the class's problem. It's something external. And again, you can look at this here if you want the words written out. Low consistency, high consensus, high distinctiveness can also be situational or dispositional here. All right. And I can say sort of this is one example. You can probably logic your way through a couple of other examples, but we're going to be weighting sort of the likelihood of it being internal or external in sort of a logical fashion. Okay, before I get too much more tied into that, we do want to move off into some of our errors of attribution here, one of which is our fundamental attribution error. And this is our tendency to make dispositional attributions when we're looking at the behavior of others, even if we should have been making a situational attribution. So your lab partner is late and you say that it's a them problem, they're lazy and irresponsible, you've made a dispositional attribution. But maybe it's more likely that there's traffic, and you should have made a situational attribution. And if we were looking at things like sort of waiting to see how that person reacts, waiting to see what their excuse is, and maybe not being overly aggressive to start, you've still made that dispositional attribution. Now, as I've said, this is when we're explaining other people's behavior. And the reason why this is specifically for looking at the behavior of others is because, again, if we're looking at our own behaviors, we have more information. If you are the person who's late for a meeting, well, you're sitting actively in traffic. You know that this isn't a you problem. You know that there was construction where there shouldn't have been, and they've closed down this area. So I'm stuck, but it's out of my control. You have that knowledge, you have that information, you know your own motivations, you know it's not you. But when you're looking at somebody else's behaviors, we're again making assumptions based on limited information available to us. And we're usually a little bit more cautious when looking at others' motivations. So we're kind of protecting ourselves. I'm going to assume that they're maybe taking advantage, and I'm going to be sort of cautious moving forward. Until they show that they can be trusted, I'm not going to trust them. And of course, we have some interesting studies that actually show this fundamental attribution error. This one was done quite a while back. So this is back in the 60s. Jones and Harris wanted to look at sort of our attributions of somebody's motivations in a very specific way. So here they had a bunch of participants that came in and they read either pro or anti-Castro speeches. At the time, Fidel Castro was sort of a very important figure and very popular in the news, so people had opinions of their own, usually very, very negative opinions. And they were told that those sort of speeches had been written by a member of the debate team. Now, one group of our participants were told that the debate team members had been given free rein to choose what side of the argument they wanted to argue for. Are they pro Castro or anti Castro? And of course, the sort of good side in this situation is anti Castro. But the other group were told that they had been assigned this stance. So they had no choice in the matter. And in that case, if we're thinking logically, we know that the person writing this particular speech doesn't actually have this opinion. We have no information on their opinion. And if we wanted to go with pure chance, we have sort of 50-50 odds. All things being equal, they might be for or against. And if we don't have extra information, we can't really say one way or the other. But if we're told that they've chosen this, then we know which side they're on. But when we look at our data here, so this is kind of a weird one to look at. So chosen versus assigned, the chosen matches what we would anticipate. This axis here is sort of a scale of how pro versus anti-Castro they think the person who wrote the speech is. And if you are told that they chose to write a pro-Castro speech, obviously you're saying that they are pro-Castro. Whereas if they chose to write against him, then they are anti. That makes sense. But with the assigned group, if all things were equal, if we had just a logical evaluation, having been told that these people didn't choose this, we should be saying some number right in the middle here, right around that 40 mark, theoretically, but depending on the scale. But if we look at it here, we actually find that they rated the pro-Castro speechwriters as more for him than against him, only based on the fact that the speech was pro-Castro. They completely dismissed the fact that they had been given useful information that actually told them that they didn't have a say in this. So we have this sort of violation where they actually dismiss useful information that would actually help them be more accurate in their responses. And this is something that comes up in a bunch of different cases. People actually tend to dismiss useful information. I think we've mentioned this before, the fact that when we have our biases, people tend to be really, really bad at using pure logic. So we tend to not do things like assume, oh yeah, we have two options, so it's a 50-50 chance. We don't do that very well. We tend to rely on assumptions, mental sets, those shortcuts, and it tends to steer us wrong in a lot of cases. So you might also have seen this called sort of dismissing or ignoring the sort of baseline or ignoring the provided information. And that's basically when we are given numbers, probabilities, and we kind of ignore them completely. There's another case that they do this. I don't think I have the example in the slides, but they look at not so much sort of different groups, so from different countries or different backgrounds or whatever, they actually look at occupations, and they would give people a whole bunch of resumes in a stack, and they would say, all right, in this stack of 10 resumes, there are 5 lawyers and 5 carpenters, and we need you to determine which is which. And the resumes are all generic. There's a couple of bits and pieces that are things that are not directly related to either profession. But if they mention things like being detail oriented or organized, they're much more likely to put those people in the lawyer pile. And at the end, if they biased sort of some of those details, you'll actually end up with, say, 5 plus, more than half of them in one grouping or the other, even though we were told that it's a 50-50 chance. There should be 5 in each pile, but they end up sort of biasing based on assumptions. So this is another one of those common shortcomings, same logic behind a whole bunch of different ways we make mistakes. So before I do even more of those tangents, what are some of our potential causes of this fundamental attribution error? In this case, again, we kind of lack that understanding of situational causes. So we don't have that experience knowing what that person has experienced. And while in the experiment they gave you that information, we're not actually used to having that information. So most of our assumptions are actually going to end up being based on sort of the other information. We're going to overrate or over rely on certain pieces of information that we can get from external observations. And we're really going to dismiss things like being explicitly told some background info. This also applies where somebody might come and give you an excuse, an actual explanation of why they were late or why they did something, and you might be less inclined to trust that, especially if you've already made your mind up that it was something personal that caused this. So if you had decided that they were late because they're irresponsible and untrustworthy, you might then take their excuse that they hit traffic and be even less likely to believe it than if you hadn't made up your mind already. So you might say, well, they should have thought of traffic. So they're still irresponsible. They should have seen that coming. Whereas if you yourself got stuck in traffic, you'd be like, I never could have seen this coming. We have very different standards for ourselves because of our experiences. So yeah, in a lot of these cases, those situational causes are often hidden, and we're not good at making use of them, even if they're blatantly provided. So it's a lot more difficult for us to make these situational attributions. So our default for other people tends to be personal. So we tend to make assumptions where you see how somebody acts and you assume that's telling of who they are as a person rather than the moment that it's happening. And of course, that's not always the case because we also have some biases when we look at our own actions. So I've said before, we're making assumptions on our own actions based on our own experiences, but I've also hinted at the fact that people don't like to be wrong or to be the bad guy. So we tend to give ourselves a little bit more grace than we would give other people. And this, of course, has its own name. Everything has a specific label. But this is called the actor observer effect. This is our tendency to make situational attributions for our behaviors while making dispositional attributions for identical behaviors of others. Basically saying that fundamental attribution error only applies to other people. We have our own, much kinder explanations for ourselves. And that's, again, because we tend to have more information about ourselves. And again, I have a standard example for this, which is think about driving on the highway. If you are driving behind somebody who's really slow, you're right up on their bumper, you're as close as you can get, and you're just like, come on, do the speed limit if you're going to be in the fast lane. Or you need to move over, you're a menace on the road, you shouldn't be able to drive. Having learned very early to drive just outside of Toronto, I can tell you that that is a fairly common mindset when you drive with others. So you sort of get really, really mad about it. But if somebody else comes up behind you, so maybe your person is just pulled over and there's some maniac who's come up behind you doing 140 and they're right on your bumper. And you're like, holy smokes, this guy shouldn't be on the road. They're so aggressive. They're right up behind me. Well, in that case, are they doing what you were just doing to the person in front of you? So in that case, you have information about yourself. You are sort of the main character in your own story. So if you're being inconvenienced by the person in front of you, they're too slow because for you, you are sort of the important thing. This is what the standard is. And if somebody's going slower than you, they're going too slow. And if they're going faster than you, they're going too fast. We like to be right in the middle. We like to be the correct person. We see ourselves as our standard. So we have experience about our own events, and we tend to frame other people's behaviors in comparison to ours, with ours as correct. All right, what else can we talk about? We also have something called the self-serving bias. Again, another very specifically named thing, and it ties once again to the fact that we like to think highly of ourselves. And this comes down to the fact that if we are successful in a particular pursuit, we are much more likely to make a personal attribution. I did really well on that last midterm because I'm really smart. I studied really hard, I put in the effort, and I deserved that good mark. But if we ended up failing, we will have more situational attributions for failure. I got a lower mark than I wanted on that test, but it's because the questions were too hard. or we weren't given enough time, or it wasn't clear, the writing was sort of vague. So this is somebody else's fault. Let's put it on the instructor or the test or something else. You might even say things like, well, I was sick that day, so I wasn't performing optimally. You are not taking sort of personal credit for it. It's not something about you and your abilities. It's something about the environment, the situation that led to that failure. And this is something that's very different depending on the groups we're looking at. There are all sorts of factors that can take effect here. So, psychological state is an interesting one. I think I've mentioned before that depression is something that tends to change the way that we think, and it tends to lead to more negative thought patterns. So, this self serving bias actually ends up flipped on its head for individuals diagnosed with depression. If something goes wrong, they tend to say that it's because they are not a great person. They're going to take credit for their failures. They're going to blame it on how not smart they are, or how poorly they do at school, how bad they are at this subject. Whereas if there's a success, they're going to blame that on external things. Well, I'm a bad person, so I must have done well because it was a really easy test. So they have that sort of negative framework where they're not claiming their successes and they're taking on blame for their failures. So, sort of that double negative. And this is actually, again, something we'll come back to when we talk about our psychological disorders, because those negative thought patterns are actually part of the depressive triad, that sort of means that you have these negative thought spirals. We can also find that culture can have a pretty dramatic effect here. And I think we have a slide for this, so I'll only mention it quick here. But basically, it depends on the environment in which you're raised. So we've talked before about individualistic versus collectivist cultures, where individualistic cultures are more focused on the individual. So you would be more likely to take credit for your successes because you're focused on you. Whereas if you come from a collectivist culture, then it's a lot more about the group, the social environment that you've been surrounded by. And in those cases, success is something to be shared with those around you. So you're much less likely to make that personal attribution of success because of the culture that you've grown up in. So there's all sorts of ways that these things can be influenced by whatever's considered normal in that group. And again, there's a whole section on group norms coming up. We also have a couple of things to consider here. There's at the end of each of these sections, I've kind of thrown in a bunch of topics that don't really fit nicely anywhere. The first of these is our primacy effect. This is kind of cool because when we're presented with information, we actually tend to pay more attention to the information that we're given first. And a lot of this comes from the fact that when we enter into a social encounter with somebody we've never encountered before, we know nothing about them. We can maybe make some assumptions based on stereotypes if there's something visible that helps us identify them as part of a particular group. But for the most part, we're kind of, again, lacking information. We're making assumptions based on incomplete information. So when we're handed information, we're going to latch on to that. So that's why I was saying before, if you have that sort of negative interaction, somebody's late for your meeting and you think of them now as a very negative and irresponsible person, you're now going to be interpreting all of their subsequent actions through that lens of your assumption. And that whole self-fulfilling prophecy definitely fits in here. So we tend to put a lot of weight on early information because that's all we have. So we're constructing how we think about this person and who they are and how they act based on only a small number of bits of information. And as we accumulate more, there is that potential to start changing. But again, people don't like to be shown to be wrong. So that first impression ends up actually being fairly powerful. And over time, if we have consistent evidence that goes against that first impression, we can go back and resolve that. We can go back and update it, but we tend to be resistant to that, at least to start. Now, there are different ways you can manipulate this and minimize that effect of our first encounter. And basically, a lot of this comes down to forcing people to slow down and consciously think about what's going on. Even if we go back to our speeches, pro or anti Castro, In that case, if you do the exact same experiment, but get people to slow down and think about those probabilities, the logic behind it, if you get that slower, more advanced processing, people tend to lose a lot of that bias. And the same goes here with these primacy effects, where given more time and sort of having to think about this stuff critically, we end up finding that the bias is less influencing. And again, how we think, this kind of makes sense. Where when we have our mental shortcuts, those sort of heuristics or default ways of thinking, our schemas, those are going to be a fast way of solving a problem. We talked before about that sort of quick and dirty solution where I'm going to make a quick decision based on limited information and maybe it works. But we also have that slower processing. And that applies not just for problem solving, but it actually applies for how we interact and think in our day to day lives. Where if we're forced to stop and think more deeply, it is a slower process. It is more cognitively intensive. We have to do it more intentionally, but it's also less likely to be biased because we're actually able to step in and say, wait a second, logically speaking, I now know this information and I should integrate that before I answer. So if we slow down, that's why we tend to see some of these effects going away or at least being minimized. Uh, the cultural attributions early on. I should have dragged this one more slide back, but the collectivist versus individualistic, just what I had said. Individualistic, more personal attributions were focused on the individual. The point here of a Western bias, this is something to do with the literature. And I don't know that we've used this term before, but Western bias is often used to talk about the fact that the literature that you're going to encounter, if you say do a whole literature review, the vast majority of the research that you encounter is going to be coming from North America or it's going to be coming from Western Europe. Yes, West. So in those cases, we have many, many individualistic cultures that are contributing. And a lot of it can be tied back to things like these are where a lot of these labs were first established. Also, language barriers. It's really hard to start reading stuff that's been published in other languages. So, in countries that don't primarily speak English, they end up underrepresented when you're doing an English only literature review. So, that bias can come in and play a role on a whole bunch of different levels. So, just something to keep in mind when you start looking at, say, review papers, because there's typically an underrepresentation of sort of non-English speaking countries. The biggest examples you'll find whenever we're looking at collectivist cultures, there are many, many examples of these, but almost all of them will end up being sort of East Asian countries. And so we have little representation outside of that. So again, a little bit of bias, not necessarily because of our way of thinking, but actually a bias in the research and review process itself, which is interesting to note and kind of important to keep in mind when you move forward.